Welcome to the Psychology Iceberg. At the top of the iceberg, we have surface level terms, which we will call pop psychology. As we go deeper and deeper along the iceberg, the entries will get more intriguing and obscure. Psychology is the study of the behavior of humans and non-humans, both conscious and unconscious phenomena, as well as mental processes such as thoughts, feelings, and motives. 16 personality types. According to the Myers-Briggs system, there are 16 personality types. Your personality type consists of 4 letters that are derived from 4 categories: extroversion and introversion, sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, and judging and perceiving. Projection. The process of displacing one's feelings onto a different person, animal, or object is called projection. For example, if someone bullies a peer about his insecurities, the bully might be projecting his own struggles with self-esteem onto the other person. Serotonin hypothesis. This refers to the serotonin hypothesis of depression, which originated in the 1960s. It states that the reason for depression is a lack of serotonin in the brain. Learning styles. The first model of learning is called the VARK model. It's an acronym for visual, auditory, reading, or writing, and the kinesthetic style of learning. I think all of these are self-explanatory except for the kinesthetic model, where people learn best through hands-on experiences. For example, learning history can be done through role-playing. Then there's the Kolb's learning theory model, which includes 4 learning styles. The first is learning through concrete experiences, which includes reflecting on experiences, abstract conceptualization, and learning through active experimentation. Lastly, there is the Gardner's multiple intelligences model. It focuses on linguistics, logical and mathematical thinking, spatial learning, musical learning, learning about the body, and naturalistic learning, which emphasizes having a strong connection to the environment. Munchausen syndrome. Munchausen syndrome refers to a psychological condition where someone pretends to be ill and deliberately produces symptoms of illness in themselves. All of this is done to gain attention.
May I have your attention, please?
Individuals with the Munchausen syndrome will engage in deceptive behavior. This usually includes lying, but can go as far as manipulating medical records or even causing self-harm. What is interesting is that patients with this syndrome actually possess extensive medical knowledge. Treating this illness is often very hard because patients usually resist acknowledging and seeking help. It's also possible that patients will impose this syndrome onto their children, resulting in their child contracting Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Treatment involves psychotherapy and a multidisciplinary approach that may include psychiatric and medical help. Neurodiversity. There's a growing field of study that examines how people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and dyspraxia experience the world. So traditionally, many conditions that fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity have been considered disorders. However, the neurodiversity movement challenges this view, arguing that these differences are simply variations of normal human brain function. Proponents of neurodiversity argue that these differences can be seen as strengths rather than weaknesses. For example, people that are on the autism spectrum often have strong attention to detail and a unique perspective of the world. People with ADHD may be highly creative and energetic. People with dyslexia may have exceptional language skills, and people with dyspraxia may have excellent spatial reasoning and problem-solving skills. Dark psychology. Dark psychology is the study and practice of manipulating and controlling people's minds. It involves using tactics like motivation, persuasion, and coercion to get what someone wants. Dark psychology includes narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. I think we ought to explain Machiavellianism. It's a personality trait characterized by cunning, manipulation, and a strategic approach to achieving one's goal. This is often done at the expense of others' ethics and well-being. It includes manipulation, strategic thinking, lack of empathy, and a calculated approach and adaptability to different social situations. Dark psychology is also used by attorneys, politicians, salespeople, and public speakers. Everyone is unique. From a biological perspective, yes, every single organism is unique, but it gets a bit more complicated when looking at it from a psychological point of view. Ask yourself, is everyone truly one of a kind? I would say yes and no. There are traits that are specific to entire generations, and if we look at the broader picture, there are aspects that belong to the entire human race. Within the broader perspective, we aren't all unique. But looking at it more deeply, everyone is, and let's explore why. Every single person is 100% unique in the way that every single thing that has occurred to you up until now, in the exact order that it has happened to only you and you alone, which makes you unique. Free will. This one is self-explanatory, but I will add this. Are all of our actions predetermined and hence not free, or are we in fact free agents in charge of our decisions? Some thinkers like Sam Harris hold the view of scientific determinism, suggesting that free will is a lie that we tell ourselves as a society. This can lead to dangerous consequences like excessive blame being placed on an individual for actions that can be explained by environmental pressures. Trauma. Trauma is a deep emotional scar that is caused by extremely distressing experiences. It can affect your mental health and can lead to PTSD. There are many different types of trauma. There is acute trauma, which results from a single, very often life-threatening event. Chronic trauma, which arises from prolonged exposure to stressful situations, for example, ongoing abuse or neglect. And lastly, there is complex trauma, which stems from being exposed to multiple traumatic events. Responses to trauma are psychological and can cause the fight, flight, or freeze response, emotional distress, or intrusive memories. Its impacts on mental health are very serious. It can cause PTSD and mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and substance abuse, to name a few. Treatment is possible with a specific kind of therapy. There are trauma-focused therapies like exposure therapy, where a patient is safely and gradually reminded of their traumatic events with the goal of reducing avoidance behaviors and helping with processing the traumatic memories. There is also the method of eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which utilizes bilateral stimulation, which is a technique that involves creating rhythmic back and forth movement and sensation. This is done by using things like eye movement, tapping, or sounds in each ear. This back and forth motion is believed to help the brain process and make sense of distressing memories, making them less overwhelming and easier to cope with. Gender identity. Gender identity is the personal sense of one's own gender. Constructivism. Constructivism is based on the idea that people actively construct or make their own knowledge, and that reality is determined by your experiences as a learner. There are three subcategories of constructivism. First is cognitive, which states that learning should be related to the learner's stage of cognitive development. Next is social, which focuses on the collaborative nature of learning. Students rely on others to help create their building blocks, and learning from others helps them construct their own knowledge and reality. Lastly is radical constructivism. The overall idea is that knowledge is invented, not discovered. Learning in this view is about adjusting our mental models as we encounter new information. It challenges the idea that there's an objective reality out there that we all perceive in the same way. Empaths. Empaths are highly sensitive individuals who have a keen ability to sense what other people around them are thinking and feeling. Or in other words, people with a lot of empathy. Cognitive functions. Cognitive functions are mental processes that allow us to carry out any task. They include orientation, memory, language, and attention, just to name a few. Cognitive functions start deteriorating as we get older, but there are other factors that affect them, such as neurodegenerative diseases or mental illnesses. DSM. DSM stands for
the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
The purpose of this manual is to provide a common language and a set of criteria for mental health professionals to diagnose and classify mental disorders. Dark Triad. The term dark triad refers to a trio of negative personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, which share some common malevolent features. Cultural differences in mental disorders. Let's first define what a culture means. Culture is a set of beliefs, values, practices, and norms that characterize a society. Culture influences our view of ourselves and the world around us. Openness to discussing mental health varies depending on the culture. Some cultures are more open to it, others not so much. Imagine our worldview as a lens through which we see the world. The lens is shaped by our cultural beliefs and values, and it can majorly impact our mental health. In some cultures, it's more acceptable to express emotions openly, while in others, the norm is emotional restraint. Some cultures emphasize individualism, while others are on the collectivist side. Studies have shown that depression is more common in cultures that value individualism and achievement. And while anxiety disorders are found across all cultures, they tend to be expressed differently throughout different ones. In the Western world, anxiety is often experienced as fear or dread. In contrast, in the Eastern world, it may be more likely to be experienced as physical symptoms such as heart palpitations or dizziness. IQ. An IQ test is supposed to gauge how well someone can use information and logic to answer questions or make predictions. Average IQ varies across different countries and different professions. The global IQ average is around 100, while the average IQ of a chess grandmaster is around 135. Magnus Carlsen's IQ is estimated to be at 190. Personality disorders. A personality disorder is a mental health condition where people have a lifelong pattern of seeing themselves and reacting to others in ways that cause problems. There are three clusters of personality disorders, which we're going to refer to as PDs from now on. The first is Cluster A, which classifies eccentric disorders. Paranoid PD and the schizoid PD fall under this class. Paranoid PD is characterized by deep distrust and suspicion of others. Schizoid PD involves patients not wanting close relationships, an indifference to praise or criticism. Patients also rarely express strong emotions, little desire for sexual activity, and hobbies and jobs that are solitary in nature. Next, there is the cluster B, or emotional disorders. This involves antisocial PD, not to be confused with asocial PD. Antisocial people disregard the rights of others, lack empathy, and usually violate societal norms. And also borderline PD, which involves instability in relationships, self-image, and emotions, accompanied by impulsive behaviors and an intense fear of abandonment. We also have histrionic PD, which is marked by excessive attention-seeking, emotionality, and the need to be the center of attention. Lastly, narcissistic PD is characterized by a grandiose sense of self-importance, a preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, and a lack of empathy for others. The last is cluster C, or anxious and avoidant disorders. Avoidant PD involves social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation, which leads to avoidance of social interactions. Dependent PD involves an excessive need to be taken care of, leading to submissive and clinging behavior. Lastly, we have the obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD, which involves preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and control of the environment. This is different from OCD, which is marked by recurrent intrusive unwanted thoughts, anxiety, and distress. Attachment styles. Attachment styles are characterized by different ways of interacting and behaving in relationships. There are 4 attachment styles. The first one is secure attachment, where people tend to feel safe, stable, and more satisfied in their close relationships. Next is the ambivalent or anxious preoccupied style. These people tend to be overly needy. Then there's the avoidant and dismissive style. These people try to avoid emotional connection with others. They'd rather not rely on others or have others rely on them. And lastly, the disorganized or disoriented style, also referred to as fearful avoidant attachment. It stems from intense fear, often as a result of childhood trauma, neglect, or abuse. Adults with this style of insecure attachment tend to feel they don't deserve love or closeness in a relationship. Behaviorism. Behaviorism is a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning, and conditioning occurs through interaction with the environment. Behaviorists believe that our actions are shaped by environmental stimuli. Most notable here is the difference between classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning works by developing an association between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. In the experiment of Ivan Pavlov, dogs associated the presentation of food at first with the sound of a bell, then with the sight of a lab assistant's white coat, and eventually the lab coat alone elicited a salivation response from the dogs. And operant conditioning is a method of learning that occurs through reinforcement and punishment. Notable psychologists include Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner. Dimensionality of mental disorders. Dimensional models of personality disorders conceptualize PDs as qualitatively rather than quantitatively. This is different to the traditional approach, in which an individual does or does not possess a disorder. According to dimensional models, personality disorders are classified according to which characteristics are expressed at which levels, as opposed to the categorical models. Another example would be the diversity of mental disorders. Even if 2 people have the same diagnosis, they might not act or feel the same. Another point to make is that there is a severity gradient to mental conditions. Within anxiety, there are multiple, let's say, levels to severity. One person's anxiety might not be as severe as another's. Reification of diagnoses. Reification means treating something abstract, like mental illnesses, as if they're concrete and exist on their own, separate from how people think about them. The current argument often talks about naturalistic reification, which means defining mental illness as a physical problem in the brain that can be proven by scientific evidence. Moral psychology. Moral psychology studies how people integrate moral ideas with the development of their own character. It encompasses the study of moral judgment, moral reasoning, and moral character. Psychologists in this field also examine the cognitive processes people use when making moral decisions, and how they navigate moral dilemmas. Inadequate treatment options. This refers to various limitations, challenges, or gaps in available therapies for mental health conditions. For example, not all mental health conditions respond equally well to existing treatments. There could also be accessibility issues, such as financial constraints or a lack of mental health professional. It could also be due to stigma or resource limitations. Serotonin hypothesis is wrong. We talked earlier about the serotonin hypothesis of depression. Well, that theory is wrong. It has been proven false in 2022. There is still no de facto answer to the question what causes depression. Rather, there are many possible causes of depression, including faulty mood regulation by the brain, genetic vulnerability, and stressful life events. It's believed that several of these forces interact to bring on depression. Replication crisis. This refers to an ongoing crisis in not only psychology, but also medicine, natural, and social sciences, where many scientific studies are difficult or even impossible to reproduce. Now, as you might imagine, reproducibility is essential for verifying the credibility of a study.
In college, I did my thesis on time perception, and I learned my favorite science story ever, which is how we learned that bees can perceive time. The experiment is pretty straightforward. A scientist put sugar water outside of a bee's hive every day at 4 p.m., and soon enough, the bees learn to leave the hive every day at 4 p.m., even when there's no sugar water. Therefore, these bees must be measuring and perceiving time. Whoa, hold your horses. What if the bees are just doing something else, like measuring the angle of the sun? So they did the experiment, again, in the dark this time, and the bees still come out at 4 p.m. Therefore, bees... Well, hold on, what if they're measuring the heat from the sun instead? These back and forths kept happening until they ended up recreating the experiment underground in a salt mine. And still, people were like, what if they're measuring the rotation of the Earth? How do we prove that bees perceive time? Until one scientist did the exact same experiment, not in a salt mine, but in Paris, and then flew the bees to New York City, where they left the hive at 10 in the morning because they had jet lag, because bees perceive time.
The diametric model. I believe this refers to the diametric model of autism, specifically to the contrast between social cognitive performance of psychotic disorders like severe depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, and the autism spectrum disorder. So, this theory proposes that psychotic disorders and the autism spectrum disorder represent two extremes of a social brain continuum, where patients with the psychotic disorders have an overdeveloped brain and patients on the autism spectrum disorder have an underdeveloped brain. Cognitive trade-offs. This refers to the cognitive trade-off hypothesis, which argues that in the cognitive evolution of humans, there was an evolutionary trade-off between short-term working memory and complex language skills. Specifically, early humans sacrificed the robust working memory seen in chimpanzees for more complex representations and the hierarchical organization used in language. Some critics have brought up research contradicting the ideas proposed by the cognitive trade-off hypothesis. First, there is not necessarily a need to have lost certain functions to gain new facilities, as the human brain is about 3 times larger than the brain of the chimpanzee. Another criticism is that the cerebral cortex in the human brain, which plays a key role in memory, attention, awareness, and thought, contains twice as many cells in humans as it does in chimpanzees. Gene-environment correlation. Gene-environment correlation, or RGE for short, refers to the phenomenon where genes influence individual variations in exposure to adverse and protective environments. There are 3 types of RGE: passive, evocative, and active. In passive RGE, parents pass on genes and also provide an environment, both of which influence the child's development. For example, depressed parents are more likely to pass on depressogenic genes to their children. They are also less likely to provide high levels of warmth and emotional support, and more likely to model maladaptive thinking styles. Next is evocative RGE. In evocative RGE, heritable traits influence the reaction of others and hence the environment provided by others. For example, a shy child may be less fun to other children, making them less likely to want to spend time with them. This sort of an environment may then lead to depressive symptoms. And lastly, in active RGE, we're going to use the same example of a shy child, but in this case, this child may have reduced motivation to go out with their peers. This could also lead to depressive symptoms. Genomic imprinting. Genomic imprinting is a natural process of silencing genes through DNA methylation. Try to think of genes as instructions in our DNA that tell our bodies how to grow, develop, and function. Genomic imprinting is like a special label or tag that can be put on these genes. This labeling process can silence or turn off certain genes. Now, imagine you have 2 copies of a specific gene, one from your mom and one from your dad. Normally, both copies of the gene would be active and doing their jobs. However, with genomic imprinting, one of these copies can be silenced or turned off. This silencing happens through a process called DNA methylation. When a gene is methylated, it means it has a tiny chemical tag attached to it. This tag can effectively switch off the gene, preventing it from working properly. In genomic imprinting, one of the gene copies gets this metal tag attached to it, which turns it off. The other copy remains without this tag and stays active, so you end up with one working gene and one silenced gene, based on whether it's been marked with the metal tag or not. An example of genomic imprinting could be in the developmental process. Imprinting is crucial during early stages of development, influencing processes such as growth, embryonic development, and placental function. Genes involved in growth and development, like those related to fetal growth, metabolism, and brain development, are often subject to imprinting. Heterogeneity. Let's imagine a research study group that is comprised of men and women who belong to different age groups, professions, and nationalities. This is what we would call a heterogeneous group. Heritability. Heritability is a sort of measurement system that determines how well differences in people's genes account for differences in their traits. Traits include characteristics such as height, eye color, and intelligence, as well as disorders like schizophrenia and the autism spectrum disorder. Heritability is measured from 0 to 1. A heritability close to 0 indicates that almost all of the variability in a trait among people is due to environmental factors, with very little influence from genetic differences. For example, religion or language spoken have a heritability of 0 because they are not under genetic control. On the other hand, a heritability closer to 1 indicates that almost all of the variability in a trait comes from genetic differences. More complex traits in people, such as intelligence and multifactorial diseases, have a heritability somewhere in the middle, suggesting that their variability is due to a combination of genetic and environmental factors. DSM is an outdated research paradigm. We mentioned the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders a bit earlier. It turns out to be outdated because it oversimplifies complex mental health conditions. Some critics states that it doesn't integrate well into the latest scientific research, so overall it's outdated. Extreme male brain theory. The extreme male brain theory states that all people with autism process the world through a male lens and take an interest in stereotypically male topics, and that they may have trouble with tasks that women are usually better at. In the mid-90s, Simon Baron-Cohen conducted tests of social intelligence and pattern recognition. He conducted these tests among people who don't have autism. He found out that women tend to perform well on the tests of social intelligence, whereas men tend to excel at following rules and recognizing patterns. He found that autistic people generally have trouble with the former, but do well with the latter. Life history theory. Life history theory is a principle of evolution and occurs naturally. It explains the behavior observed in many species, including humans. Certain organisms have evolved certain strategies to maximize their reproductive success in specific environmental conditions. These organisms ask themselves the following questions. Should we have lots of babies, or should we have less babies and take good care of each one? Some have lots of babies quickly, but don't spend much time taking care of them. Others have fewer, but spend more time and effort on each one. When to have babies? Some have them early, others later in life. How much to care for babies? Some provide a lot of care, like humans. Others leave their babies to fend for themselves. Then there's also the question of adapting to the environment. In a tough and unpredictable environment, it might be better to have lots of babies quickly and not invest too much in each. In a stable and comfortable environment, it might be better to have fewer babies but take really good care of them. Predictive processing. The theory about predictive processing states that the brain is constantly generating predictions about the sensory inputs it receives from the environment. Sexual selection of mental disorders. This theory discusses why there are differences between men and women in terms of diseases and mental health. It identifies main reasons: sexual selection and sex hormones. The researchers propose a theory called the sexual selection sex hormone theory. It explains that in the evolution of males, including traits that help them attract mates, there are also negative effects that make them more vulnerable to diseases. Interestingly though, females develop stronger immunity according to this theory, although it could also be possible that due to changes in female sex hormones related to reproduction, stress, and social conditions, that females might be at a risk of increased mental health disorders. Temperament. This is a very broad subject, but temperament refers to the constellation of inborn traits that determine a child's unique behavioral style and the way he or she experiences and reacts to the world. There are 4 temperament models, first described by Galen in the 2nd century AD. We are going to describe the traits of people who fall under that model, the bodily fluid, and the celestial object that is connected to the model. First is the choleric type. This is connected to bile and fire. A choleric person is irritable, can be violent, uncontrollable, and restless. These people are dominant and assertive. They are high achievers at work and school. Next is the sanguine type. It's connected to blood and air. These people are energetic, lively, optimistic, and easygoing, typically extroverted and sociable. They can also be impulsive and indecisive. Next is a phlegmatic type. This is connected to mucus and water. Phlegmatic people are slow, unresponsive, but calm and cool-headed. They are usually passive, careful, but also thoughtful, reliable, and stable. They tend to avoid conflict at all costs, which can lead to them missing out on opportunities. Lastly, we have the melancholic type. This is connected to the black bile and earth. Melancholic people are depressed, repressed, and pessimistic. Although they are calm, they are often anxious and stiff and not very sociable. Neurotransmitter systems. You might have depression or anxiety, or maybe both if you're unlucky. That is because your neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine don't work as they should. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers. They facilitate communication between neurons. These messengers travel across a tiny gap called a synapse, enabling signals to pass from one neuron to the next. They regulate breathing, heart rate, and physiological functions such as learning, mood, fear, pleasure, and happiness. In order for neurons to be sent via neurotransmitters, they need to communicate with each other. They tend to do that through synapses. There are three classifications of neurotransmitters. First are the excitatory ones. When we say a neuron transmitter has an excitatory or stimulating effect, it means it encourages the receiving neuron to fire up and send its own signal. It's like a cheerleader. Next are inhibitory neurotransmitters, which have the opposite effect. They tell the receiving neuron to take it easy and not fire up as much. What this does is it decreases the chances of the neuron sending a message. Lastly, we have modulatory neurotransmitters. In this case, you should imagine the neurons as instruments. Think of modulatory neurotransmitters as the conductors of the brain orchestra. Instead of directly playing the instruments, they guide and influence a large group of musicians at the same time. These neuromodulators don't press the play button directly on neurons. Instead, they team up with other neurotransmitters. They can boost the excitement or calmness of the neurons by working alongside other messengers. There are over 50 known types of neurotransmitters. We are going to explain just a few main ones. First is adrenaline, which is responsible for the fight or flight response. Next is the GABA transmitter, which has a calming effect. It calms down firing nerves and contributes to motor control and vision and improves focus, but low levels of the GABA transmitter cause anxiety. Lastly, we're going to mention dopamine, or in other words, the feel-good chemical. It's also involved in addiction, but also movement and motivation. We repeat the behaviors that lead to dopamine release. Meta traits. There are two main ways that researchers look at personality. The first approach is called the nomothetic approach, which says that you can understand someone's personality by figuring out where they stand on a small set of traits. This approach doesn't care much about how important each trait is for the specific person. The second approach is called the ideographic approach. It states that certain traits matter more for some people than the others. It's important to consider how relevant each trait is to an individual and not treating all traits as equally important. So, how do meta traits work? In short, researchers are trying to not just measure personality traits, but also understand how crucial these traits are to an individual. Understanding meta traits is important because the relevance of a given trait to an individual's personality is expected to determine whether the trait influences the individual's experience and behavior. Motivational architecture of emotions. Emotions serve as emotional signals that influence human behavior and decision-making. There are several theories and models in psychology that explain the motivational aspects of our emotions. We are going to explain the key ones. I'm going to list three of them. First, we have the James Lang theory. Fear, feeling afraid. It's logical to think that the feeling of being afraid comes first, followed by the physiological responses like an increased heart rate and trembling. Well, William James and Carl Lang propose that it happens the other way around, that feeling afraid occurs because we first experience physiological responses like an increased heart rate and trembling. Next is the Cannon-Bard theory, proposed by Walter Cannon and Philip Bard. They say that emotions and physiological reactions occur simultaneously, triggered by a common neural pathway. Lastly, we have the cognitive appraisal theory. You receive a high grade on a challenging exam. If you interpret the high grade as a result of your hard work and intelligence, you will feel proud. If you attribute the grade to luck, however, you will feel undeserving of that grade and experience embarrassment. This is what Richard Lazarus and other psychologists behind the cognitive appraisal theories believe, that individuals evaluate events based on their relevance to personal well-being and goals. The emotional response is then determined by these appraisals. Now, I don't exactly know why this entry is on the iceberg, because moral nihilism and nihilism in general is a philosophical topic rather than a psychological one. What I will attempt to do is briefly explain the philosophy of a moral nihilist and then explain what psychological state a nihilist may be in. Moral nihilism is a meta-ethical view that nothing is morally right or morally wrong, and that morality doesn't exist. Moral nihilists believe that there is no universal right or wrong, good or bad. According to the believers of moral nihilism, statements like stealing is wrong or helping others is good don't express any objective facts about the world. Instead, they're just expressions of personal opinions and societal conventions. Let's now look at the psychological factor behind nihilism. Personal experiences, such as an existential crisis, can prompt individuals to question the meaning of life. Intellectual skepticism and a commitment to rational inquiry can drive some individuals towards nihilism. Schizophrenics are more logical. There was a study that tried to figure out if schizophrenic people are more logical thinkers. There were two groups. One consisted of 17 schizophrenic patients and the other of 19 non-schizophrenic people. They didn't differ much in terms of IQ before they got sick, their age, and education. I'm going to refer to the schizophrenic patients as just patients from now on. So, the patients performed better overall on the problems that required more logic. Although both groups performed better on the non-common sense problems, the patients did perform better than the non-patients. This aligns with a well-known phenomenon called belief bias, suggesting that logic has a stronger impact on conclusions that are hard to believe, or those that are non-common sense, compared to those that are easier to accept or more common sense. Overall, the patients didn't perform much better at these problems, and it's also worth mentioning that the group with the patients had more men than the control group, and men in general are better logical thinkers. Take this study with a grain of salt. It's probably not conclusive, but still an interesting one nonetheless. Identity isn't real. Who are you? You might answer this question with information about your age, race, or profession, although you will probably just reply with your name. In any case, our concept of identity usually revolves around explaining our existence. You might introduce yourself as an engineer or a lawyer. You know your accomplishments and everything that has happened up to this point and has shaped your so-called identity into who you see yourself as right now. But think about it. To some people, you are simply someone's brother or sister, or a husband perhaps. To others, you're the guy with the brown hair, or just the guy they saw on the bus who had really nice pants. We all want for other people to get us and appreciate us for who we truly are. But how do we know who we are? Think about this topic. Do you think identity is real? Dimensionality of genetic syndromes. A genetic syndrome refers to a set of characteristics associated with a specific genetic abnormality. The psychological aspects of genetic syndromes include variations in cognitive abilities, social interactions, emotional regulation, and adaptive functioning. We are going to mention 4 dimensions of the genetic syndromes in psychology. First is intellectual disability. For example, people with Down syndrome often have varying degrees of intellectual disability. The severity can range from mild to moderate, impacting their cognitive functioning and learning abilities. Next, we have to mention behavioral disorders. Some genetic syndromes are linked to specific behavioral issues, such as ADHD, aggression, anxiety, or autism spectrum disorders. In the context of genetic syndromes and behaviors, we mean that people with the same genetic syndrome may show a broad and varied range of behaviors. Next are social and communication skills. We are going to look at the autism spectrum traits here, more specifically someone with Rett syndrome. Now, if you don't know what Rett syndrome is, it is a rare neurological disorder that primarily affects girls. The syndrome leads to a loss of purposeful hand skills and spoken language, as well as slow development. They may also have problems with coordination and movement, as well as cognitive and social impairments. Lastly, we have psychiatric comorbidities, specifically mood disorders. We mentioned comorbidities earlier, so let's refresh our memories. It means that you have 2 or more disorders at the same time. Genetic syndromes are typically associated with increased susceptibility to mood disorders such as depression or bipolar disorder. The dimensionality here means that scientists are concerned with how these genes and emotions interact. Facial morphology. Facial morphology refers to physical structure and characteristics of an individual's face. This includes features such as the shape of the nose, eyes, mouth, and overall facial proportions. But this isn't the physiology iceberg, so we must explore key psychological roles of facial morphology. Facial features play a big role when it comes to attractiveness. Studies have shown that individuals with symmetrical and proportionate facial features are often rated as more attractive. Certain facial features, such as a symmetrical face, clear skin, and an overall well-groomed appearance, will contribute to making other people trust you more. The morphology of facial muscles and bone structures influences an individual's ability to express emotions through facial expressions. In simple terms, a smile means you're showing a positive expression. We humans are highly skilled in recognizing faces, and facial morphology plays a key role in this ability. The next topic isn't really widely accepted, but some researchers argue that facial features associated with health and reproductive fitness may have evolved to signal genetic quality to potential mates. Think about our societal norms and cultural standards. They can shape the perceptions of facial beauty. Different cultures may prioritize different facial features, which in turn influences standards of attractiveness and social acceptance. Certain facial anomalies can have psychological implications, affecting self-esteem and social interaction. For example, facial asymmetry can lead to a negative social perception. Lastly, we often make assumptions about others' personality traits based on facial features, whether we like to admit it or not. Addiction isn't real. Mark Lewis was a drug addict. He was slumped over in the bathtub one day. unresponsive. He suddenly woke up from his heroin-induced coma. His friends thought he was dead. Mark dropped out of university and had been busted raiding a pharmacy. That was 34 years ago. Mark Lewis is now a developmental neuroscientist based at the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. The prevailing theory is that addiction is a chronic brain disease, a progressive and incurable condition that can be kept at bay only by abstinence. Mark Lewis argues that addiction is the result of deep learning, which he believes is triggered by stress or alienation. He also argues that it can be unlearned by forging stronger synaptic pathways via better habits. He also believes that essentially the US medical system has a desire to keep people addicted. Now, to be honest, I wasn't able to find much about addiction not being a real thing. There is the argument that an addictive personality isn't real and that it isn't diagnosable, which only means that it isn't listed in the DSM-5 manual, for which we established is outdated earlier on. So, overall, I would say that addiction is a very real thing. I also came up with another argument of why addiction might not be a real thing. For example, not all smokers are addicted to smoking itself. For example, they smoke only when they're drinking. These types of smokers are not going to get a craving for a cigarette when they're just out and about, but they are going to get it when they are drinking. So addiction in this specific case is actually linked to environmental factors. Mental disorders are the true personality type. I am absolutely lost when it comes to this entry. I have no idea what it is referring to, and I wasn't able to find anything about it. Subcultures represent shared psychological traits. The term subcultures refers to smaller, distinct groups within a larger culture that share common interests and behavior that differentiates from the dominant culture. These subcultures have shared psychological traits. For example, they share common values and beliefs. They form their own identities, which gives them a feeling of belonging. They exhibit shared behavioral patterns, such as their hobbies and lifestyle choices, the same communication styles, and social norms. Political beliefs are underpinned by personality traits. There are differences between conservative and liberal political beliefs. This entry refers to the belief that instead of demographics, what plays a significant role in shaping their political choices is their personalities. However, according to Science Direct, the 5-factor model of personality traits doesn't suffice. Instead, we should be looking at the hexaco model. The hexaco model is actually an extension of the 5-factor model and includes the 6 major personality dimensions. H stands for honesty and humility and reflects sincerity and a lack of greed. E stands for emotionality, which refers to the degree of sentimentality and fearfulness. X stands for extroversion and measures sociability and liveliness. A stands for agreeableness and reflects organization and diligence. And O stands for openness to experience and assesses creativity and open-mindedness. Now, what this entry states is that if someone likes change and values fairness, for example, they will probably lean liberal. If instead they prefer stability and tradition, they will lean conservative. My 2 cents here is that this entry probably shouldn't be that low on the iceberg. I think it's pretty common sense that your personality traits will determine your behavioral patterns, career choices, and decision-making styles in general, and also political beliefs. If you are curious, you can also look up how our personalities reflect what types of games we play and also what might our playstyles be in those games. It's an interesting topic, but again, I believe it's quite common sense. Identity, political correctness, religion, racism share the same psychological cause. The concepts of identity, political correctness, religion, and racism share a common psychological cause rooted in social identity processes. Individuals characterize themselves and others into groups, shaping their identity. This influences attitudes and behaviors, leading to phenomena like political correctness, religious affiliation, and racism, all driven by the desire for a positive social identity. That's all there is to this entry. A desire for social identity leads us to political correctness, and so on. Discussed inversion hypothesis of sexuality. Alright, so this theory was actually investigated and created by the creator of this iceberg. They say they did 2 studies that supported it, but that they haven't put the results online yet. They also say that this model that they came up with explains virtually every paraphilia. Now let's first explain paraphilia because it's not a very common term. It refers to atypical or unusual sexual interests, fantasies, or behaviors that deviate from what is considered typically or culturally normative. These interests can involve unconventional objects, activities, or situations, and may be necessary for an individual to achieve sexual arousal or satisfaction. Now, this might not actually be safe for YouTube, so I suggest that you look up what fetishes are included under this term, because it's kind of weird, I'm not gonna lie. Alright, so according to this hypothesis, the physiological response to disgust can actually enhance sexual arousal. In other words, things that might be considered repulsive or disgusting can, under certain circumstances, become targets of sexual attraction. This phenomenon is said to occur based on individual attraction and can be observed in various sexual interests, including more taboo paraphilias. What they also found out is that if you're attracted to someone, you will find fetishes including pee, saliva, and so on not disgusting. If you are not attracted to someone, however, you will find these things repulsive. Basically, the idea is that whether we like or dislike certain body-related things plays a big role in what we find attractive or unattractive. Alright, we are moving to the 8th and final layer of the iceberg. Unrotated Big Five. The term Big Five refers to the 5-factor model or the Big Five personality traits. Just to refresh our memories, those traits are extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. When we apply factor analysis to the Big Five traits, we aim to identify the hidden dimensions that contribute to how these traits are correlated, aiming to reveal broader patterns and individual personalities. Now we must explain what the term rotation means. After the 5-factor analysis, researchers use rotation to make things easier to understand. The two common rotations are varimax and Oberlin rotations. Varimax rotation is like adjusting a puzzle to make it easier to solve. Imagine you have a bunch of personality traits that are connected in a complex way. Varimax rotation rearranges them so that each group of traits is strongly connected to only a few specific things. The idea is to make the factors more independent and easier to understand. It's kind of like organizing the traits neatly, so you can see clearly which ones go together, making the whole picture simpler. As for the Oberlin rotation, imagine you have different aspects of your personality, like how outgoing you are and how friendly you are. But in real life, some aspects of personality are connected. Oberlin rotation is like reorganizing and allowing these connections. So if being outgoing is linked to being friendly, Oberlin rotation keeps that connection. It's more like arranging puzzle pieces that are related side by side. Now, the term unrotated Big Five means looking at the initial results of a personality study before any adjustments. It's the raw data, straight from the analysis. Empathy is socially deviant. Many belief systems have strict rules about what is considered right or wrong. People are expected to follow these rules, and those who don't often face criticism. Empathy, on the other hand, promotes a different perspective on morality. It encourages us to look beyond the rules and consider why someone behaves in a certain way. This approach helps us be more understanding and compassionate, seeing people in the context of their own unique situations, rather than just labeling them as rule breakers. In essence, empathy challenges the idea of strictly adhering to rules and encourages a more open-minded and tolerant approach to others. Another very interesting fact that relates to this entry is that sympathizing with someone who has committed socially or culturally unacceptable things is considered moral transgression. Societies have a set of established moral standards and norms, which define acceptable behavior. When someone violates these standards, sympathizing with their actions can often be seen as going against the established norm, which can be labeled as moral transgression. Think about if you have ever tried to understand someone who has committed a crime. Let's imagine a homeless drug addict robbed a store. You might be the type of person who considers their side of the story and how life has treated them up to this point. That they didn't have a stable upbringing, maybe their parents were drug addicts themselves. If a young child sees their mom and dad high all the time, that's what they consider normal. So there is no other path in life for this person. Maybe you try explaining that to someone who criticizes this person when they see what they did, but your explanation is now seen as moral transgression, because how could you justify someone robbing a place? A replication crisis isn't a crisis. Earlier, we explained that replication crisis is an ongoing crisis in psychology and other fields involving scientific studies, where they are difficult or even impossible to reproduce. Well, some argue that this is in fact not a crisis, but rather a sign of a field undergoing necessary self-correction. The ongoing discussion and improvements about replication are the following. Researchers should pre-register their study design, methods, and analysis before collecting data. Another is the adoption of open science practices, which argues that researchers should provide open access publishing, sharing of data and code, and collaborative research, sort of like how some programmers open source their code. Overall, the replication crisis might be a blessing in disguise for the long term. Rationality is maladaptive. In psychology, rationality refers to the capacity of individuals to think, reason, and make decisions based on logical and objective considerations. But why might rationality be maladaptive? Let's first define the term maladaptive. It refers to behaviors, thoughts, or strategies that are not helpful or suitable for a person's well-being and effectiveness in dealing with life's challenges. Alright, so let's get to the main topic. In certain cultures and social contexts, decisions that may seem irrational from an individualistic perspective might be considered rational when viewing within a broader cultural framework. Human cognition is also susceptible to biases that can lead to irrational decision-making. In some situations, problems may be highly complex and uncertain, making it challenging to arrive at by a purely rational solution. In conclusion, rationality isn't always the answer. For example, imagine your friend is going through a rough time, experiencing emotional distress. A strictly rational approach might involve providing logical solutions and advices to fix the problem. However, in many cases, what the friend may need is more emotional support, empathy, and a listening ear. Pharmacological modifications of personality. Believe it or not, it is very much possible to modify personality through medication. Lithium, for example, is a medication that is used to treat bipolar disorder. It works by stabilizing mood and reducing the frequency of mood swings. Lithium has also been shown to have a significant impact on personality traits. For example, it has been shown to reduce levels of irritability, impulsivity, and aggression. It may also lead to increases in social withdrawal and anhedonia. Anhedonia refers to a condition where a person experiences a reduced ability to experience pleasure or interest in activities that they used to enjoy. So, this has been the Psychology Iceberg. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I see you in my next video. So, hi guys, this is me off the script. This has been my first video ever. I would really like to make more videos. I'm interested in psychology and philosophy, also gaming, but more so the psychological side of gaming, how they impact our brain and minds and so on. So you should probably expect some videos in that way. But yeah, I was actually pretty nervous when I started making this video, specifically the voiceover. But then after like the first or second layer, it started going smoother and smoother for me, which I was really happy about. And at the end, I was actually really comfortable and started really enjoying making the voiceover. So yeah, that's basically it. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.